All right, so I wanted to call this Coming to Believe just because my journey has really been an ongoing one. Navigating healing is something that is never easy. So my name is Kyra Doubek. As Eric mentioned when he introduced me, and as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I am a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. I grew up in Washington State, actually. I spent a few years up in Alaska when I was very young, and I spent time down in Oregon when I was in middle and high school. And I tell you this because when we're talking about just navigating the systems of instability that survivors face, I think that it's important to note that I moved over 20 times by the time that I was 18 years old. And so that's less than a year in each location as I was growing up. I'm a second generation survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. My mom was also exploited. Abuse and domestic violence were normal things in my home. And my story is not any different than the stories that I've heard as a direct service provider, as a survivor seeking support, and now as a person in leadership in this movement. Whenever I hear people talking about fully decriminalizing prostitution, this is something that really sits with me. And this quote by Herbert Spencer says, "There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation." And part of my contempt prior to investigation, when I exited the life on December 10th, 2012, because I had a law enforcement interaction that was not related directly to my exploitation, but was peripherally attached to it, because I also have substance use disorder and I've been in recovery for almost over 7 years at this point. I thought that legalizing and regulating commercial sexual exploitation was the answer. I thought that it would make it safer. I thought that it would keep people from being trafficked. I thought that it would end harm. I thought that it would allow for people to not only have like regulations around safety, condoms, STD testing, all of these things. And it's because I hadn't done any research. And so when I went to my very first really educational experience around commercial sexual exploitation provided by the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, I remember very clearly leaning over to another survivor and saying, "But wouldn't completely legalizing this make it better?" And this person looked at me with absolute horror and said, "No, it would not." And I'm going to hopefully share some of the reasons why legalizing prostitution or full decriminalization of prostitution, meaning decriminalizing the person in prostitution, decriminalizing the sex buyer, and decriminalizing the manager, pimp, whatever they're calling themselves, third-party exploiter, whatever, is not the answer. So when I say I'm an ACE, for those of you who don't know what Adverse Childhood Experience Score, ACEs, is, ACEs really talks about this experience of traumatic events between the ages of birth and 17 years old. And the ACEs questionnaire or quiz goes through a series of questions. And these questions are involved with domestic violence, substance use disorder in the home by a parent or a caregiver, abuse and neglect, so access to food, access to shelter, whether or not your family member has been incarcerated, it covers a whole lot of topics. And the score is, goes up to 10, and I'm a 9 out of 10. And so when I think about my vulnerabilities, just due to the fact that I've experienced trauma, it is undeniable that I was a prime target for somebody to exploit me. And when I think about like what that 9 out of 10 score looks like for me, and I'm going to run through this really quickly. I experienced physical abuse as a child. I experienced domestic violence in my home a ton as a child. A ton as a child. I was the one who had to call 911 when my mom and my stepdad got into it. I moved a ton, as I already mentioned. Substance use disorder was very prominent within my home. And I experienced incest, childhood sexual abuse, poverty. When I talk about poverty, like I'm talking canned chicken from the food bank, poor, trailer park, poor. And it was really, really challenging to try and come out of this. I always like to share this prostitution fact sheet with people, and I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to share with you that not only are these things really prevalent for me, but they are prevalent within my community. And so when we talk about who experiences exploitation, we talk about that average age of entering prostitution. And this is all from a study done by Melissa Farley, who is one of the leading researchers on commercial sexual exploitation. You can go and read her studies at prostitutionresearch.com. If you have not read the research, I encourage you to read the research, because the research does not lie. I was 14 the first time that I was approached for exploitation. I had run away from home because it was abusive. There was substance use going on at home. I did not feel safe. I grew up in a home where it was normal. When I said, I'm hungry, I was told, no, you're not. When I said I needed to use the bathroom, I was told, no, you don't. And so when we talk about just some of the things that happen for people, I am used to my body not being mine. I'm used to not listening to my body. In fact, even today, and I'm almost 8 years out of the life. It'll be 8 years on December 10th. And I still have a hard time recognizing when I'm thirsty, when I need to use the bathroom, and when I'm hungry, because I've been disassociated from my body since I was 4 years old. That is normal for me. When we talk about like who reports a history of incest or sexual abuse as a child, I have heard, and I've served hundreds of clients, and I've talked with hundreds of survivors from all over the world, and hearing this common story is just very much like my story. I mean, it's so common for me to hear I was raped by an uncle, my father, my stepdad, my brother, a cousin when I was a baby. That is just as common in my mind for somebody to say, like, I've made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my lifetime. And so for me, I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal, right? The history of incest, like I said, 70% of people who are exploited reported that they experienced incest. Porn was something that was used to educate me by my exploiter. And we find that pimps normalize, or exploiters or managers, whatever they want to call themselves, normalize abuse through pornography. Because pornography, as most of us know at this point, has gotten increasingly violent, and it is normalized. Like, that violence is normalized. That's where, unfortunately, most people are going for sexual education, which is incredibly problematic, especially when you look at the fact that people do not have, it is not shown that people need to have like mutuality and consent and relationship in that sense, right? 90% report having a pimp. 85% report being raped by their pimp. And I've had several pimps. I engaged in survival-based sex, in prostitution, where you receive money for a sex act. I've been groomed online by men starting at 12 years old when America Online started, really to step onto the stage as a possibility or platform for grooming kids for exploitation and abuse. When that rape number comes up, like, I have been raped so many times, I couldn't even tell you how many it's been. It happened daily, multiple times daily, for over 5 years, not including the people who purchased me for sex, which is essentially paid rape. We always don't, like, something that you don't hear talked about is men and trans folks in this issue. There's not a lot of studies, but Melissa Farley did talk with folks from many different gender identities and backgrounds. And what we're finding in 5 countries, South Africa, Thailand, Turkey, USA, and Zambia, 62% have been raped in prostitution by a buyer. 73% physically assaulted. 72% are currently or formerly homeless. I was homeless off and on between the ages of 18 all the way up until 26 when I finally got out of the life. When we talk about who is in prostitution and wants out, immediately 92% of those surveyed. So 475 people in prostitution, 92% want out now. Mortality rate. We have a high mortality rate, and this is in connection directly to what Jerry and Eric were talking about. We have high instances and propensity for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. 75% of us have attempted suicide. I am somebody who has had many instances where I was convinced that dying would be the best solution. 15% have completed suicide or died by suicide. Another study out of Colorado Springs talks about this, and it was a 33-year study that studied almost 2,000 women that were in or are in commercial sexual exploitation experiences. And the average age of death is 34 years old, a year older than I am. And most of the time, the cause of death is homicide at the hands of buyers. So when we talk about prostitution or sex work, it is harmful. Absolutely harmful. So when we're talking about what the Nordic model means for survivors, we need to decriminalize the person who is being prostituted, exploited, or engaging in sex work. Most of us, I haven't met anybody who hasn't experienced all or most of these: childhood abuse, childhood sexual trauma, or incest, poverty, violence, domestic violence, rape. Buyers and pimps really capitalize on our vulnerabilities and commodify the abuse and normalize it. When you're used to being molested or raped or having to trade sex for a safe place to sleep like I did, it becomes normal that I am like a human credit card or a human cash machine, right? It's normal. And it should not be normal. Comprehensive and holistic services for people who have experienced complex trauma. We need specialized support for safe housing, legal services, substance use disorder, mental health support, education, professional training, and long-term emotional support. We need communities where we can connect, heal, grow, and like fly. And Eric and Jerry have talked about this need for culturally appropriate services. And that's absolutely true. I've served, like I said, predominantly folks of color. I've served lots of Native American folks. I've served trans folks. And what I can tell you is that all of the violence that I've told you about, and I used to get my butt beat by my parents. Beat. That everything that I experienced was still a lesser violence than people who have more intersections of race or gender or socioeconomic class than I have. And my life has been incredibly violent. I'm talking like torture, physical and mental and sexual. And so when we're talking about like those safe and holistic supports, what they look like, I needed a place where I could talk about it. I went to treatment for substance use disorder, and I'm so grateful to be clean. But I'll tell you what, nobody ever screamed me for being exploited. Nobody at the jails that I went through screamed me for being exploited. Nobody helped me. I talked with teachers and nurses and school staff and friends' parents and my own family, and nobody helped me. So we need to have holistic services, and that is what the Nordic model, also called the equality model, really talks about, is decriminalize people who are prostituted, give them services and off-ramps, give them holistic services. Services can do a lot of things. I had a section counter. I received a whole bunch of support, and if I hadn't, like, support groups, yoga, getting in touch with my body, like all of it, if I hadn't had those spaces, I would have never ever believed that I had the ability to pay my bills, because my parents told me I'm nothing without him. I can do anything without him. My parents told me that I have no chance of ever figuring it out. When I got out of the life, I never had a bill in my name. My credit score was the 280, and yes, it can go low. I've never had my name on an apartment lease. I never rented a place for myself.
Kyra, excuse me. Your sound was cutting in and out, and I'm just wondering if we can maybe we can adjust the video, turn off the video, and maybe try with just the sound, or if there's another way we can clarify the sound.
Okay, how's the sound now?
It's clear.
Okay, wonderful. Sometimes it does that. Thank you for the heads up. What I was saying is that really there's no limit to what I can do now. And I've moved into roles that, like, if you had asked me everything I wanted when I exited the life, I would have never told you anything that I've done since I've gotten out. I've served on a couple of boards since I've gotten out of the life. I've moved into leadership positions. I've served survivors. I've worked alongside police, and I hated police when I got out of the life. And I was very fortunate to work with some people that were specialized and trained in this issue. I've gotten my own home. I live in a quiet neighborhood. I'm in a relationship that is built on the foundations of trust, respect, and mutuality, but I still struggle, and I still struggle to get out of bed, and I still struggle with triggers and trauma and all of the things that happened with me in the life, and I still struggle to know who I am and where I stand sometimes. When we're talking about the Nordic model, what it means for pimps and exploiters. So sex buying is a criminal offense. Buyers don't care if you have a pimp or a manager or a marketing guy. They never ask. And really, the truth is that most of them can't wait to go and review people like me, like a dishwasher, on their little sex buying websites that have sometimes up to 20,000 buyers. I have literally been reviewed like an appliance. And that's all they saw me as an appliance. And it was violent, and it was violating. And I had pimp slip condoms and all kinds of, and I had buyer slip condoms. And nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about when you're in a room with a guy that's twice as big as you, how you can say, no, I'm not really interested in that. Like, I've been sodomized and all kinds of shit. Like, the truth is that unless you've experienced it and you've had some time to step away from the trauma, when you're still sitting in your trauma, it's really hard to speak about what kind of violence you've experienced. It means that pimping and sex trafficking is criminalized. These are abuses of human rights. And truthfully, like, my pimps talked about how they were going to protect me and how they were going to never leave me alone and how we were going to get all this and how they were going to make sure that I never had to worry about anything ever again. And it capitalized on my experience of lifetime abuse. Really, the human rights approach is address the roots of exploitation: poverty, racism, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, and more. We need to have prevention programming in schools. We need to educate upcoming generations on the societal problem of buying sex and exploiting others. We need to have training for police and for people who provide services to providers, medical personnel, counselors, substance use disorder, legal advocates, the whole gamut. That's how we stop the cycle of abuse and misplaced blame, lack of services, and inadequate care for survivors. And I've received a lot of inadequate care over the years because people didn't understand. And lastly, we need laws that protect people who are targeted for exploitation, not the people who monetize and commodify the abuse of other people. And so, really, again, we need to educate people. We need to have policies that support it. We need to have public awareness. We need to prevent it from happening. We need to provide services to survivors, holistic wraparound services. And we need to decriminalize them and criminalize people who are doing the abuse. We need to not legalize commercialized rape. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyra.